Hello, welcome to the lecture. I'm going to discuss the incel movement, which is the involuntary celibate movement, which is a violent extremist set of groups that often involve people on the internet and specifically heterosexual men who have a great deal of rage against society and engage in cyber crimes that involve hate speech and incitement of violence on the internet that then sometimes leads to public enactments of rage, including mass shootings. And some of the rhetoric that incels use often involves a sense of victimization as men who feel as though women, and specifically privileged middle class women, have denied them attention, sexual attention. The rhetoric also involves racism and feelings of victimization uh, because of the existence of successful or middle class people of color who have more access to capital than those who see themselves as white or historically privileged because of colonialism, because of slavery. So essentially, incels then engage in violent acts of extremism against the general public because of the passage of modern laws that protect women from rape, sexual harassment, and the passage of laws that protect queer people from forced heterosexualization and forced marriage, and the passage of laws that allow people of color um, and people who are not Christians or who do not have an ancestry or history that connects them to the original, say, colonial settlers in North America or the original colonizers of indigenous peoples. So this sense that what the incels are actually acting out against is law, affirmative action law, the feminist movement, which has enshrined um, laws against rape and has given women the right to vote and the right to choose their own partners. And so that is my understanding of the articles this week. And I'll discuss the relationship between incels and the law in detail. The lecture could involve some traumatic videos regarding cases of mass shooting. And so I will give a trigger warning. If you are sensitive to images or depictions of violence, you might not want to watch the lecture. But the clips are all from news media regarding shootings and murders. There was an incel attack in Canada, in Toronto, Canada, and many people were killed when a man drove his car into a crowd of people, wounding some and killing others. And this was one instance of incel extremist violence or rage. Incels could be characterized also as terrorists in the sense that many acts of terrorism often involve an outrage towards modern secular capitalism and the law, and this desire to return to some sense of order. And so the sense of order is often about men being in positions to choose female partners who cannot reject them. And the sense of order is often even about men who are entitled to jobs or to successful careers because they are cisgender heterosexual men. And it sometimes involves a return to some order of racial or religious hierarchy, where some of the men who participate in incel and some of even the women who participate in the lesser known and researched group femcel believe that they are entitled to things because of their race or caste. They also feel a great deal of rage against middle class couples who choose each other and are successful. So I'll share my screen and discuss the readings from this week's readings on the syllabus that are about incel. And so these are the readings this week, and I will discuss the Srinivasan reading in greater detail because it is the required reading. And I'll also touch on these other readings, one of which discusses Incel as a terrorist organization, and the other article discusses rape culture and social media in detail. So firstly, I'll play this clip about Amia Srinivasan's book, which is a full-length book that draws on similar themes as the article that is on the syllabus.
Very honoured to be joined by Amia, who has written an absolutely phenomenal book, The Right to Sex, which
Sorry,
while you're watching this now or listening to it on the podcast, just buy it now, instantly. Boom, like that. It is absolutely brilliant. It will always be topical, but so I was going to say it's particularly topical right now, but actually I think it's one of those books which, regardless of the circumstances, will always have themes which are particularly salient. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me here, Owen.
So I think what is on a lot of people's minds at the moment is the horrific events which taken place in Plymouth, in which 5...
Okay. Sorry, I have to try sharing my screen again. I apologize. For some reason, it's freezing, and I don't know why.
But those moments have their limits. I mean, consciousness raising has...
I'll start it again.
Very honoured to be joined by Amia, who has written an absolutely phenomenal book, The Right to Sex, which while you're watching this now or listening to it on the podcast, just buy it now, instantly. Boom, like that. It is absolutely brilliant. It will always be topical, but so I was going to say it's particularly topical right now, but actually I think it's one of those books which, regardless of the circumstances, will always have themes which are particularly salient. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me here, Owen.
So I think what is on a lot of people's minds at the moment is the horrific events which taken place in Plymouth, in which 5 people have died. And we obviously, there was an investigation in process, with all those caveats aside, but we know that the gunman posted videos online which clearly subscribe to incel ideology. Do you just want to explain for people clearly? Because some of the news reports on this have not been helpful, I would say. They kind of talk about incel being like some sort of coherent cohesive group or movement, which isn't obviously true, but some people might not know that. So just want to unpack your kind of reaction to what these events and what it tells us, and what do we mean by incel? What does that actually mean? Because there's so much confusing coverage for lots of people.
Right. So literally speaking, the word incel is just a shortening of involuntary celibate. So it's supposed to pick out any person who involuntarily isn't having sex or maybe has never had sex. In practice, though, it picks out a member of a very specific subculture. So I don't think of incels as any kind of political movement, but I do think they constitute a subcultural phenomenon of typically young men who are extremely angry and disenchanted by, as they see it, their marginalization within like the sexual economy and their low status within a sexual hierarchy. And they, unfortunately, very frequently act out this perspective violently by killing people. So Elliot Rodgers is probably the most high-profile case, but we also had the Toronto van attack, and now we have what happened at Plymouth. So there's a very kind of clear connection between the radicalization that happens online in these online forums with actual material action.
And it was striking in these videos. I mean, he was 22 and was speaking as though his life was over. It was too late to salvage. But part of what he was talking about in these misogynistic videos, which he posted online, was again this incel ideology. Which, I mean, maybe just unpack this a bit. Is this idea that that 80% of women they're going after 20% of the most attractive men, and therefore leaving lots of other men deprived of what they see as their right to sex.
Right, exactly. And I mean, so there's on one hand the kind of official line that incels take, and then there's the kind of deeper diagnosis that we can offer. So the official line is that, a small number of men, chads, are hoarding all of the women, or a big proportion of that women, sort of not leaving enough for everyone else. Now, of course, this is already on its own terms incredibly problematic, because it's positioning women as a kind of resource that can be hoarded, right? As and to which people can be entitled, right? To which men can be entitled. But looking further, looking like more deeply into it, I mean, first of all, it's just like statistically not true, right? So there are all of these sociologists who will just tell you that actually, like, there are a vanishing small proportion of men who are having sex with lots of women. It's just there just isn't a kind of capture of 80% of women, and that actually there are very, very few people who are, totally celibate, involuntarily celibate, and lots of them are women, right? So that's kind of the reality of it. So what I think of what's sort of really going on with incels, despite their just like claims to being like lonely and left out, is a deep rage at a sexual hierarchy that they think that they register too low on, right? Because they're not interested in women in general. They're not interested in companionship. They're not interested in like mutuality or recognition. What they're interested in is acquiring a certain kind of high status woman, right? A woman who they think of as accruing to them a certain amount of social capital. So they're very interested in, what they like Stacey's, right? So white, blonde, like stereotypically attractive, skinny women. Those are the women they want. So these things, the incel discourse can wear the veneer of the cry of loneliness, but fundamentally what I think it's about is about hierarchy. And it's a social hierarchy that in one sense they critique, right? Because they're very angry at those who dominate the hierarchy. And they're very angry at the fact that they perceive themselves to be low on the hierarchy. At the same time, they're not actually interested in dismantling that hierarchy or any other, right? So they're very invested in, for example, hierarchies of women, racial hierarchies, hierarchies of attractiveness, hierarchies of class. So Elliot Rodger was obsessed with the fact that he was from a very wealthy family. He talked about the fact that he was supposedly descended from British aristocrats. He hated young Black men who were more romantically successful than him. So in a way, they're like halfway to a kind of radical critique, but then they bluntly drop off the cliff of just extremism and entitlement.
We'll stop it there. When I post the PowerPoint slides online, you can watch the full discussion if you're interested in this topic for your future research or future assignments. So Srinivasan discusses the case of Elliot Rodger. Elliot Rodger, a 22-year-old college dropout, became the world's most famous incel, involuntary celibate. The term can, in theory, be applied to both men and women, but in practice, it picks out not sexless men in general, but a certain kind of sexless man, the kind who is convinced he is owed sex and is enraged by the women who deprive him of it. So the reason that I mention the law is that the law is really not about hierarchy. Modern laws allow us all to make choices. So we can choose who we have romantic or sexual relationships with. We can also say no. This is also true about labor and class, that if someone chooses to work constantly or keeps trying to sell their labor over and over again, then the money that they will earn is theirs. They can also choose to not spend a great deal of money. And over time and over generations, they could then have more financial capital than others, irrespective of ideas of hierarchy that existed, I guess, before the modern law. Hierarchies of, say, skin color or religion or race, gender, sexuality. Law is really about the sense of equality. And obviously, we all have the right to sell our labor. And so someone who has middle-class parents or affluent parents might be more successful. And they might be more successful because they have parents who can pay for them to go to very expensive schools or can introduce them to people. But these kinds of forms of inheritance don't stop the modern law from working in certain ways. So someone who has multiple part-time jobs could work at these jobs and could save their money. And they could actually save more money than someone who has wealthy parents. Then they could buy property. The right to sell one's labor then can change the class structure over generations. This is also true of education, that people can apply for scholarships, they can get loans, they can get lines of credit. And if they are the best and most outstanding students, then this can change the class structure. The final set of laws is obviously about gender, sex, rape, romantic love. Women do not have to consent to having sex with men. We've discussed transgender and queer and lesbian rights in Canada. Canada has comprehensive two-spirit LGBTQ plus rights. And so someone does not have to consent to being in a heterosexual relationship. And all of this is really about rights and freedoms, which challenge these kind of hierarchies that did exist and were specifically used to kind of uphold structures of power, which would have prevented women from working and which would have forced people to be in heterosexual marriages and would have also guaranteed men more money than women who would have been confined to the home and forced to marry and then to have children and often not allowed to work outside the home. Like this kind of very old way of thinking about life is really expressed in this kind of rage of the incel movement, who often have these ideas of going back to the past. It's why in the language on social media, incels sometimes even use this language of knights and kings. They often sometimes make allusions to white nationalism, and to these ideas of pre-modern rules, and structures of power that exist, or that, I guess, do not exist unless someone is going to violate the law. And incels obviously are criminals, and some have been characterized as terrorists. So, as a philosophy, liberalism often upholds the law, and liberalism grants us equality in law, the equal right to sell our labor, to say yes or no to relationships, to enter into contracts. And contracts can be labor contracts. We also enter into social contracts with each other, meaning, yes, I consent to being someone's friend, or no, I do not, or yes, I consent to having sexual intercourse with someone, or no, I do not. And this is how kind of modern rational societies proceed. But incels obviously have a great deal of rage when they are told no, and when people whom they imagine should have lesser power than them have the right to say yes or no, and also have the right to education and to class mobility. And so, therefore, many people have written about incels as terrorists. So this is a clip about Elliot Rodger, who was an incel and committed acts of what could be referred to as terror against the general public, in the form of mass shooting.
Last video, it all has to come to this.
News in Santa Barbara County, a gunman went on a mass shooting.
These young men often feel like they are owed sex.
The group name that you've probably never heard of before, incels or involuntary celibate.
Girls are not sexually attracted to me. There's a major problem with that. Major problem.
He attempted to get into one of the sorority houses with a tremendous amount of ammunition. Instead, out of frustration, he got in his car, drove around the corner, and saw my daughter. She was walking with two of her friends, and he opened fire. This guy had gotten into that sorority house. The damage he would have done. I mean, he would have cleaned it out. He had enough weapons and enough guns to clean out every one of them, and they would have been defenseless. We like to believe that wrong place, wrong time scenario helped save 50, 60 girls' lives. So, kind of a silver lining. And, when you're in our position, you look for these, wherever you can.
We lost our only daughter. She had so much to give for this life. Then she was killed at 22.
Elliot Rodger really flips the switch from a community that is angry online, operating within the digital space, to a community that has the potential to carry out real acts of violence.
R.I.P. Elliot Rodger, 1991, 2014.
If you want to stop this from happening to other parents and other innocent children, you need to get to the individual. You need to find a way to reach them and help them and realize that suicide isn't the way out. Going out with a bang so you can make the news isn't the way out.
The police should be looking at this in the same way they look at religious extremism online. And then at a more local level, we don't have enough discussion around mental health implications of our technological culture.
The reality of our situation is painfully simple. Our daughter died because some individual couldn't cope. If this individual had felt there were avenues for help, had felt that there were people who are willing to help him understand rejection, failure, frustration, and help him through it, then my daughter might still be here. This guy who killed my daughter is gone. He doesn't feel a damn thing, right? We feel it every day. That's our reality now.
So Srinivasan writes about the details of Elliot Rogers' rampage, and so do the other authors of this week's readings who also discuss Alec Manassian, who killed 11 and injured an additional 15 people in a vehicular attack in Toronto, Canada. In 2021, Jake Davidson shot 7 people, killing 5 in an attack in Plymouth in the United Kingdom. These are just some of the many known instances of incel violence. Upwards of 50 deaths were attributed to incel violence in North America between 2014 and 2020. So it is a fast-growing group of extremists who some have labeled terrorists. Incels endorse hostile sexism, which refers to misogyny, prejudice, subjectification, denigration, and other negative perceptions that are directed towards women. The hostile sexism of incels, along with the community's more broadly defined misogynistic attitudes, have been extensively covered in prior scholarship. In addition to misogyny, the incel ideology is also characterized by victimhood and fatalism. Inspired by the black pill philosophy of the manosphere, incels argue that men's romantic fortunes are predetermined by a combination of their physical appearance and women's strict preference for conventionally attractive men. So this sense of being a victim is one of the central philosophical discussions that Srinivasan has. And what is interesting about Amia Srinivasan's article is that the author discusses this kind of self-victimization of incel, which is this extremely conservative right-wing group of men who could be referred to as almost neo-Nazis or fascists in relation to left-wing groups of people who often have politicized the ways in which minorities are often not thought to be sexually desirable or attractive. So what's interesting about the Srinivasan article is that Amia Srinivasan also discusses the ways that subaltern communities of people, say transgender people, people with disabilities, people of color, have also discussed this politics of sexual undesirability because of oppression. And ultimately, the answer that Srinivasan's article gives us is that no one has the right to sex. So when, say, people of color or trans people, people with disabilities, talk about the ways that they are sexually marginalized, people can choose to empathize and listen and understand, but this does not mean that anyone is entitled to sex. And this is also true of these men who are incels. So Srinivasan writes, it used to be the case that if you wanted a political critique of desire, feminism was where you would turn. A few decades ago, feminists were nearly alone in thinking about the way sexual desire, its objects and expressions, was shaped by oppression. And Frantz Fanon and Edward Said's discussion of the erotics of racial and colonial oppression are important exceptions. Beginning in the late 1970s, Catherine McKinnon demanded that we abandon the Freudian view of sexual desire as an innate, primary, natural, pre-political, unconditioned drive divided along the biological gender line and recognize that sex under patriarchy is inherently violent, that hostility and contempt or arousal of master to slave, together with awe and vulnerability or arousal of slave to master, are its constitutive emotions. So we've discussed Judith Butler's work in detail in the class, and we've talked about how Judith Butler's writings regarding gender ask us to think about gender not as natural or innate, but as performative, meaning from the time that we are born and the doctor says it's a girl or it's a boy, we perform reiterative statements, sentiments, behaviors, bodily gestures under these fixed signs in the gender binary. And this gender binary also structures a heterosexual matrix of desire. So transgender identity and queer desire, lesbian, gay, bisexual, two-spirit desire challenges these kind of succinct binaries and norms, thereby elucidating the performative nature of gender. So sex itself then is not something that is innate or is pre-given because of science or biology or because of God. It is also part of a set of performatives. Since the 1980s, the wind has been behind a feminism which takes desire for the most part as given. Your desire takes the shape that it takes, and which insists that acting on that desire is morally constrained only by the boundaries of consent. Sex is no longer morally problematic or unproblematic. It is instead merely wanted or unwanted. In this sense, the norms of sex are like the norms of capitalist free exchange. What matters is not what conditions give rise to the dynamics of supply and demand, why some people need to sell their labor while others buy it, but also that both buyer and seller have agreed to the transfer. It would be too easy, though, to say that sex positively represents the co-option of feminism by liberalism. So we can think about Judith Butler's work in relation to these discussions regarding sex. Is sex something that is separate from performativity? No, I would argue that gender performativity and gender identity also shapes the ways that sex becomes part of our gendered set of performatives throughout our life course. Generations of feminists and gay and lesbian activists have fought hard to free sex from shame, stigma, coercion, abuse, and unwanted pain. It has been essential to this project to stress that there are limits to what can be understood about sex from the outside, that sexual acts can have private meanings that cannot be grasped from a public perspective, and that there are times when we must take it on trust that a particular instance of sex is okay, even when we cannot imagine how it could be. Thus, feminism finds itself not only questioning liberal distinction between the public and the private, but also insisting on it. So a lot of feminist theory and queer theory begins kind of with this sense of speculation regarding what constitutes consent, what constitutes free choices, what constitutes oppression. But we can return again to Judith Butler's work, which often looks not at speculation, but at construction. How does gender identity come to be seamlessly constructed so that it does not seem to be an identity, but it seems to be natural? And this is also true of sex. How does sex come to be kind of part of a set of performatives that are enacted throughout the life course through our use of language and the use of terms like male and female and this kind of construction of the gender binary. And how does sex then become part of this seamless set of performatives that give the illusion of naturalness? There are, of course, real risks associated with subjecting our sexual preferences to political scrutiny. We want feminism to be able to interrogate the grounds of desire, but without slut-shaming, prudery, or self-denial. Without telling individual women that they don't really know what they want or can't enjoy what they do in fact want within the boundaries of consent. Some feminists think this is impossible, that any openness to desire critique will inevitably lead to authoritarian moralism. We can think of such feminists as making the case for a kind of sex positivity of fear, just as Judith Shklar once made the case for a liberalism of fear. That is, a liberalism motivated by a fear of authoritarian alternatives. But there is a risk, too, that repoliticizing desire will encourage a discourse of sexual entitlement. So the feminist movement often has this kind of endless set of debates regarding, on the one hand, sex positivity that would allow people to express their sexual desire, but on the other hand, a sense of trepidation because of rape culture. And so this is the kind of debate that Srinivasan is having in this article when the author discusses, on the one hand, sex positivity, particularly among, say, minorities or subaltern groups who want to politicize their right to be desirable and their right to desire, as opposed to incels who essentially want to force women to have sex and force women to choose them, and who then actually punish people with murder. So then what the author is asking us to consider is, to what extent does sex positivity allow for a critique of rape or violence? That a lot of sex positive movements politicize one's rights to be desirable. Black is beautiful, fat positivity, the rights of people with disabilities to be seen to be sexually attractive. And these movements ask the public to consider their normative or their investment in, say, normative bodies and desires. However, when taken to extremes, this kind of desire to ask people to politicize their sexual desire could lead to force. And this is essentially the debate that many feminists who are interested in sex and the politics of sex are having in regards to sex positivity as opposed to rape culture. Talk of people who are unjustly sexually marginalized or excluded can pave the way to the thought that these people have a right to sex, a right that is being violated by those who refuse to have sex with them. That view is galling. No one is under an obligation to have sex with anyone else. So while left-wing movements and social movements want to politicize, say, the beauty of people who are fat or people of color or people with disabilities, this does not mean that anyone is obliged to have sex with anyone else, which would be rape. So the article is also really interesting because it touches on the politics of entitlement. And really a lot of these debates about who has the right to do something and who has the right to something is really about entitlement. We all have the right to try to do things. We all have the right to try to sell our labor. We have the right to try to get an education. We have the right to try to get people to choose us. This does not mean that we can force others to choose us. So Srinivasan then discusses this kind of personal ad, which specifically bars certain groups of people from trying to express desire or trying to have sex with the person who has decided that they don't want certain types of people to contact them. There is no entitlement to sex, and everyone is entitled to what they want, but personal preferences, such as these ones, are never just personal. And so these ads, specifically on Grindr and other sites which gay men use, often specifically state that I don't want to have sex with these types of people. And it isn't against the law to then say, no, I do not choose you. In the same way, someone could say that they would prefer to not hire someone, or they would prefer to not go to certain neighborhoods. But obviously, in the eyes of the law, if you only say hired people who were white men or white cisgender women, then the law could be used against you because of affirmative action. But sex is not really like this. It's not like labor in the sense that we can all sell our labor, and labor law and affirmative action guarantees us. Sex is a lot more like my personal preference. I don't have to eat certain food. I don't have to listen to certain music. I don't have to like certain people. And so this kind of personal preference also protects people who say practice a religion. So if someone practices Hinduism or Judaism, they cannot be forced to have a secular or sexual relationship, um, even if they live in a predominantly, say, secular or Christian society. People have the right to make very specific choices about partners because of their personal preferences, their religious beliefs, their lifestyle, their mind, and their body. So the argument cuts both ways. If all desire must be immune from political critique, then so must the desires that exclude and marginalize trans women. Not just erotic desires for certain kinds of bodies, but the desire not to share womanhood itself with the quote, wrong kinds of women. The dichotomy between identity and desire, as Chu suggests, is surely a false one. And in any case, the rights of trans people should not rest on it, any more than the rights of gay people should rest on the idea that homosexuality is innate rather than chosen. A matter of who gay people are rather than what they want. But a feminism that totally abjures the political critique of desire is a feminism with little to say about the injustice of exclusion and misrecognition suffered by the women who arguably need feminism the most. So this political critique of desire is obviously still important because it speaks to the ways that capital is not just about money. Heterosexual capital, cisgender capital, racial capital allows people to have secure and safe and healthy lives. So that if one has a romantic partner who is middle class, who can support them financially, who has housing security, then this will support someone's long-term health and even life expectancy. So desire is obviously political, but rape is also a crime, and it is a political crime that is often enacted against the most marginalized people. So those who are most likely to be raped are trans women, women of color, working class women. Obviously, in the context of Canada, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report has demonstrated that Two-Spirit and Indigenous women are most likely to experience sexual violence in their lifetime. So this kind of political critique of who is desirable also corresponds with who is most likely to experience sexual violence to the point of even murder. It is striking, though unsurprising, that while men tend to respond to sexual marginalization with a sense of entitlement to women's bodies, women who experience sexual marginalization typically respond with talk not of entitlement but empowerment. Or insofar as they do speak of entitlement, it is entitlement to respect, not to people's bodies. And so this question of who has the right to sex is also intimately linked to rape culture, that many women fear rape. And so this sense that these men who are incels feel extremely entitled to sex and are not at all afraid to talk on the internet or to write on the internet about fantasies of rape and murder, and they are not even afraid to enact acts of terror, is really about this politics of fear. That when women talk about sex, there is always this element of fear of being raped and murdered. That said, the radical self-love movements among Black, fat, and disabled women do ask us to treat our sexual preferences as less than perfectly fixed. Black is beautiful and big is beautiful are not just slogans of empowerment, but proposals for a reevaluation of our values. The question posed by radical self-love movements is not whether there is a right to sex, there isn't, but whether there is a duty to transfigure as best we can our desires. So right and duty are the language that Srinivasan uses. And when I have a right to something, it means that it is my entitlement. I can have it. It is just I have the right to free speech, and so I can speak. Duty is really moral in nature, and I have a duty to be mindful of others, a moral reckoning, which asks me to be cautious of how I use language in ways that could do emotional damage to others. So right is really kind of a language of law, but duty is more of a language of morality and even psychology. Desire can take us by surprise, leading us somewhere we hadn't imagined we would ever go, or towards someone we never thought we would lust after or love. In the very best cases, the cases that perhaps ground our best hope, desire can cut against what politics has chosen for us and choose for itself. So the idea that I would have a duty to change the ways that I think about subaltern peoples, historically marginalized peoples, those who have been historically marginalized because of colonialism, because of slavery, because of the Holocaust, because of misogyny, transphobia, is a kind of moral act. And the hope is that this kind of moral duty, this ethical witnessing of the suffering of others, would cause me to change my mind about who I see as a desirable person or who I care for and care about. And so this is the hope, but it is not a guarantee. And it is not, this does not mean that people have the right to have sex with anyone. So I'll finish by discussing incel and religious violence. So incels have been characterized as being terrorists, and the secondary readings discuss the ways that incels could be characterized as terrorists. So Srinivasan draws on Charles Fourier, who proposed a guaranteed sexual minimum akin to a guaranteed income for every man and woman, regardless of age or infirmity, only with only with this kind of sexual de deprivation or lack eliminated, Fourier thought could romantic relationships be truly free. Marxist feminists argue that women's oppression is rooted in the capitalist structure of the nuclear family and class society, which subordinates them. Sexual assault is interpreted as an extreme form of this institutionalized class-based power imbalance, where a ruling class, a bourgeoisie, exploits a lower class, a proletariat. So the idea that one is guaranteed sex and that sex is akin to kind of care and romantic love is something that Marxist feminists have really argued against. That the idea that kind of sex is a form of capital that we should all be guaranteed is not necessarily true, and that Marxist feminists argue that sex has been central to the ways that women have been prevented from actually selling their labor, that forcing women to have sex, forcing them to marry, forcing them to have children has also prevented women from getting higher education, from having the capacity to sell their labor, from having the capacity to move and take better jobs in different cities or countries. And hence Marx said the worker has no country. So if the worker has no country, the worker cannot be forced to marry and have children and do the same monotonous labor over and over again. And with the internet, the worker could find more work opportunities in a different place and move to better themselves financially. So this idea that sex is then guaranteed is really religious in nature, and it is why many commentators have characterized incels as terrorists. In her foundational 1975 essay, The Traffic in Women, Notes on the Political Economy of Sex, feminist anthropologist Gail Rubin introduces the concept of the exchange of women to explain the social origins of female oppression. Rubin argues that women's subordination is not a biological necessity, but a product of a sex-gender system, a set of social arrangements that transforms biological sex into gendered identities. Drawing on the work of Claude Levi-Strauss and Marcel Mauss, Rubin describes how kinship systems function through the exchange of women between groups of men. Men as subjects, women as objects. In these systems, men are the givers and receivers of women, while women are the gifts. The purpose of this exchange is to create social ties, obligations, and peace between different groups of men. So women historically were often part of kinship networks as objects to be exchanged, rather than as subjects who had decisions regarding who they had sex with and how they could sell their labor. And women's exclusion from the labor force, from education, from literacy, from work, was also dependent on this system of their exchange for the purposes of having children, and particularly for the purposes of having sons who would make money. And women's confinement to the domestic sphere, their lack of literacy, education, and work was really about this exchange of heterosexual men and forced heterosexualization of women. And this is still really controversial. Republican politics in the United States of America often involves still this forced kind of idea of heterosexual childbirth and forcing women to have children. And Republican politics is often involved shaming women who choose to be lesbians or to not have children, to have successful careers under the guise of religiosity. So this is a clip of Gail Rubin, and I will finish then by discussing incel ideology in relation to religious extremism and as a form of terrorism.
Hey there, and welcome to the New Discourses podcast. This is James Lindsay, and we're going to do something different today. You know, I like to read the literature, so we're going to read the literature, so it's not that different. But what we're going to do is we're going to dip out of this literally interminable critical education and critical pedagogy series that I'm doing, and we're going to dip into queer theory. So, you know, some of you will have heard the Groomer Schools podcast series, and you will have heard that summary of how both the Marxists, you know, have used sexual education of children to destabilize society. You will have heard the paper, if you've listened to the second part of that series, by Hannah Dyer explaining about how queer theory should remold early childhood education and childhood development theories so that we teach sex to children earlier. You will have heard, if you listen to the third part of that series, how the sex aspect of this, or queer aspect, queer theory aspect of this, and the critical race theory aspects work kind of like a 1-2 punch to reproduce Mao's identity-based radicalization program. What we are going to do today, though, is we're going to go to roots. We're going to do something I should have done a long time ago. It's just there's so many things to do, so many different topics to hit. I'm not going to read a contemporary queer theory paper. I'm not going to read a particularly shocking, although it is shocking, but a particularly shocking queer theory paper. In fact, I'm not going to read a paper that's technically even labeled as queer theory. I'm going to read the paper that's considered to be, the essay that's considered to be the first queer theory paper, which is called Thinking Sex by Gail Rubin, written in 1984. So this is some time ago. I mean, just to not to put too fine a point on it, but 1984 was nearly 30 years ago. Try not to think about that if you're feeling old all of a sudden. But this essay was really a shot heard around the feminist world, if you will. It really was a direct shot, and we'll probably have to do this essay in 2 pieces because it's very long. And the second piece will actually engage the direct shot Gail Rubin is taking at feminism primarily. But this was a shot at the feminist world that said that we need a completely new politics of sex and sexuality. And queer theory is what resulted. I think queer theory received its name either in 91 or 93, a few years later. Not that these things matter that much. This being, you know, so better part of half or 3/4 of a decade later, queer theory is kind of coming into its own. But here's where it begins with this essay, Thinking Sex, Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality. It lays it right out. This is the set of ideas that over the next 7 to 10 years evolved into what became named queer theory, that since then has evolved to the point where one of the major targets is the innocence of children, rethinking childhood education and childhood development theories like we hear from Hannah Dyer. The queering of every subject as it happens will be obsolete by the time this comes out, who knows when, but today on Twitter I went through and showed just a series of academic papers, queering history classes, queering math classes, queering English classes, queering elementary ed, queering 4th grade classrooms, just queering preschool, just paper after paper after paper after paper, bringing queer theory into education. Just like where critical race theory had some but limited success in law, critical race theory had great success when it went into education. Queer theory has also had great success going into education, and now we have groomer schools. And this kind of big, long trajectory starts with these feminist sex wars in the 80s. As it turns out, there was 2 major branches of radical feminism in the 80s, sex negative feminism and sex positive feminism. We're not going to get deeply into that, but this paper sits at that rift. Gail Rubin was in the sex positive category. Many of the feminist luminaries at the time were in the sex negative category. From what I understand, though I don't know this for certain, Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, which is prominent in the news, you know, every few months since the last few years or whatever, was actually written as an allegory for the dystopia that could come if the sex negative feminists, who are radical leftists, teamed up with the sex negative social conservatives, who are fairly right wing.
stop it there. It says a discussion of Rubin, which is this person's interpretation of Gail Rubin. The point that Rubin makes, though, that's important for incel is really about this evolution of exchange, that when people exchange, say, in a relationship now, it involves modern contracts. So if we are going to exchange words, we both have to consent to speak to each other. If we're going to exchange, say, um, work and we're going to exchange in ideas, then we would have to consent to work together. And this is also true of sexual exchange. So Rubin makes the point, though, that historically women were not part of this exchange, that men exchanged women with other men, and that men's kind of ties to other men, men's ties to other communities or tribes of men were often by giving women to other men. And so the incel movement then is really disturbing in the sense that what these men really feel extremely entitled towards is this exchange of women, and specifically women who they see as objects, and objects that can be kind of appraised and sought after because of heterosexual capital, whiteness, money, age, and this sense that they are kind of men who are enraged about not only the women who they see as excluding them, but the men who have access to these women, leads to these acts of mass violence where incels don't just kill women, they also kill men, and they kill indiscriminately. And it is a kind of terrorism against secular modernity and the law. So the question then is how to dwell in the ambivalent place where we acknowledge that no one is obligated to desire anyone else, that no one has a right to be desired, but also that who is desired and who isn't is a political question, a question usually answered by more general patterns of domination and exclusion. So Srinivasan wants to be mindful of the ways that, say, people of color, people with disabilities, fat people, queer people, trans people are often excluded from mainstream media as being desirable partners, while also being extremely cautious of the ways that this entitlement to desire is also the language of incels who feel as though they have the right to actually kill others because they have been excluded. And this sense that the right to desire or the feeling of being excluded is also really psychological. I mean, it's really difficult from a sociological perspective to really know who is desirable and who is not. So while, say, I don't know, someone who is not often represented as attractive in the media might not feel as though they're desirable, in reality, they could be desirable to someone who is similar to them. So Srinivasan discusses race and the ways that, say, people of color might not be desirable because of racism. But in reality, many people of color could be desirable to other people of color. So this kind of idea of who is and is not desirable is really psychological in nature. And if we allow for any space in which people feel as though they have the right to sex, then we will allow for people to essentially commit acts of violence against others. So ultimately, Srinivasan's article obviously states no one is entitled to sex, and uses these examples of incels as the most extreme example of entitlement, which leads to mass violence. So the article, I think, is really interesting in that it asks us to consider problems with relationality. The idea that we are all kind of people who owe each other something is something that those who are interested in, say, social justice movements would often consider. But what Srinivasan really does in this kind of really excellent piece of philosophy is to ask us to consider how this acting out or entitlement to others, the expectation that others are going to give us something, could actually lead to pathological violence and even terrorism. So Amia Srinivasan's book is called The Right to Sex, and Dr. Srinivasan is a philosophy professor, is a philosopher, and Srinivasan is noted for her work in epistemology and feminist philosophy. And since January 2020, she has been the Chichale Professor of Social and Political Theory at the University of Oxford. So the article is really interesting because it asks us really uncomfortable questions about entitlement and relationality. While we can be asked to question our choices from the perspective of, say, left-wing philosophy, feminists, the anti-racist movement could ask us to question if we only like images of certain people. We can be asked, but we cannot be forced to have any sort of relationships that we do not want to have. And this expectation of that we place on others, I think, in its most extreme, can lead to criminal pathology. So if I constantly expect someone else to do something for me, to care for me, to pay attention to me, I can ignore caring for myself and taking care of myself. And so one of the things that's really striking about incels is age. Many of them are young men who have all of this opportunity to take care of themselves, to build a successful career, to take care of their health, to do things for themselves. And instead, they act out in violence against the public. So I will finish by quoting from Audre Lorde: "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." And that caring for the self is not an act of terrorism against the public. It is an important act, and one that does not express the sense of kind of entitlement to others. So when taken to extremes, entitlement can lead to criminal pathology, to feeling entitled to even take another person's life, which is extremely dangerous and an act of terrorism. So that is the lecture. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that you are doing well. And that is all. Thank you.